I would like to welcome you to today's debate on just transition and the next economy, which is organized by Reset, the platform for socio-ecological transformation, in cooperation with the Prague office of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, as part of the project of the School of Just Transition. I would like to also welcome our guests, Jagoda Munić from Friends of the Earth Europe, Asad Rehman, the director of War on Want, and Ulrich Brand from the University of Vienna. The context of the project is that we have been organizing these debates and participative workshops over the year to bring the issue of the just transition into the Czech debate, which today is marked strongly by the issue of phasing out coal in face of the escalating climate crisis. The climate crisis has exploded into the public view. We have seen a great increase in awareness, and the debate has shifted from whether we should phase out coal, the dirtiest of fossil fuels, which is responsible for the lion's share of Czech emissions, to when this will happen and how, and hence the issue of how to organize this transition in a just manner has arisen, and we have been organizing this project to try to kickstart this debate and to have this conversation in Czech society over how to organize to do this process of transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables in a manner that would be just and equitable. And whereas on Wednesday we had guests from Poland, Slovakia, and East Germany, to talk about the regional experiences with participation of people in the processes of just transition on the local level. This time we would like to zoom out, as to say, into the European and global context of today's debates and political struggles over the climate and energy. And I'm really happy that we have these three guests here who have been active in these issues for many years now, and they can help us together to refine our analysis of what needs to be done and how, if we want to have an ecologically sustainable and socially equitable future economy and society. There will be a resulting publication which you will find by the end of November on our website, unfortunately only in Czech, so this is an information mostly for Czech viewers. As for the structure of the debate, I would like to start with the very first opening questions, which concerns the concept, the term that is used of system change. The climate movement has for years now been using the slogan "system change, not climate change." And as the awareness of the climate crisis grows in the previous years with the student strikes, also with the IPCC 2018 special report, bringing into view how large scale the changes needed to avert climate breakdown are. And also we can maybe remember this letter that has been addressed recently to the European Commission by Greta Thunberg and others from Fridays for Future, signed by many other scientists and activists, saying that even a child can see that the climate crisis cannot, that's what they wrote, even a child can see that now that the climate crisis cannot be resolved in this system. So my first question to you as our guests who have been dealing with this issue and promoting this view maybe in the recent years is what should we, because for many people this is still very vague, it's hard to imagine what this demand of system change means. What do you believe the key systemic changes to what our societies and economies look like you think is key, and how can we imagine such a climate just future economic system that we should strive to transition to? And I would like to start with Jagoda, then passing the word progressively to Asad and Ulrich. So Jagoda.
Dobry večer. Good evening. Thanks for inviting me today to this panel. I'm Director of Friends of the Europe, which is an environmental network of 32 environmental organizations in Europe, and branch of Friends of the International. And our member in Czech Republic is Hnuti Duha. And I'll be speaking on what the system change means from our perspective as a network, because we did start this debate quite early, I would say, and long time ago, and we progressed in the last 10 years on trying to focus a bit more like what exactly that means. So for us, a system change basically means that we want to create a world that is peaceful and sustainable, and it's based on social, environmental, and economic justice. Of course, climate justice is part of environmental justice in that regard. So we look at this as a broader perspective, not just from the perspective of how to tackle climate change, but in general, how to achieve more sustainability and justice in the same time. So basically, it has to provide we have to have socio-economic system that provides both for people and for planet, that enable us to live within planetary boundaries or in harmony with nature, depending which framework do you use. But I would say that the planetary boundaries framework coming from science in the last decade is a very good one to start to think what actually we need to achieve in terms of like limiting or global impact, not just on climate, but also on other planetary boundaries like biodiversity, pollution from agriculture, in chemicals, air pollution, and so on. So we look at this more holistic, I would say. The second thing is that it has to be just, so that means that has to deal with a growing inequality that we see between people, both global south and global north, but north and global south, and also within countries and within different strata of society. So we looked a bit more how we can actually achieve that, because it's, of course, that's very utopistic, visionary approach. And what does it mean in practice? So we say, okay, let's try to see how we can measure this system change, how we can be assured that we actually implement it when we do our work, when we do our campaigns or activities. So the first kind of principle or guidelines for us is that whatever we do, we try to contribute that we actually have activities or have campaigns that are contributing to living within these limits, planetary limits, so that there is limitation, there is no endless growth possible on finite planets. So that's the first thing. and that it contributes at the same time in the analysis to that justice. The second one is that actually we look at this power dynamics, both internally and externally. And from that debate in our network, we started to talk about more about intersectional approach, about integrating the gender elements into analysis, integrating race and class elements in, and when we analyze how are the impacts of, let's say, climate impacts, who benefits and who loses, who is impacted the most, and also in terms of providing solutions, we have to look at all these different elements and have intersectional approach. Then we also look at the corporate capture, because there is very, very big influence of corporations on decision making. And recent reports that we also have done in Europe show that even now in the recovery package that they propose, they are lobbying to get actually money for bailout of fossil fuel companies. So that's something that we want to avoid. And the last kind of principle is that all solutions that we're creating towards the system change should be based on democratic principles, on participation of different people in society, and should be bottom-up in a way approach. So these are the four elements in terms of our system change approach. And coming back to economic system, because that was also in your question, we now have very in-depth debate about elements of economic system that we have to create. Obviously, this endless principle of endless growth, of economic growth, cannot be sustained on finite planet, and we are trying to link a bit more with degrowth movement and other movements in that regard. I personally like very much Kate Rawor's donut economics, which maybe the name not per se it's not that attractive, but when you look how she actually created this visual principle of like outer circle that is planetary boundaries and inner circle that are social foundation. So basically in the same time you have to bring it below the limits and build it up in terms of social foundation and provide for all people. So that's something that is visually, I think, very attractive and easy to understand. And of course, in practice, in terms of like how to create such economy, how to create such societies, probably there is no one answer fits all, and probably we will have to, if you look at the global level, develop different pathways to that. So I would not dare to say like, we have answers to everything, and I would not dare to say this is the only way to go. Yeah, we should try to develop different approaches, but towards the same goal. And maybe for the start, that's enough. And of course, we can come back to it a bit later. Thanks.
So I think, so me? Yeah. So thank you again for the invitation to join you all. My name is Asad Rehman. I'm the Executive Director at War on Want, which is a UK-based human rights, anti-poverty, climate justice organisation. We work directly and support social movements in the global south. We have been doing for decades, and we take a very much a system change approach, trying to connect issues, recognising the importance of both vision and political demands and building power. I just want, I mean, Jagoda, I think, laid out very well some of the perspectives and some of the frames. I think maybe just important for us as a movement, you know, because I think for a long time, parts of our movement have used this word, system change. It adorned our banners and our placards, system change, not climate change. And we didn't do the necessary sort of education as to what that actually means. So first, I think just going really back to basics, I think it's a recognition that of all the problems that we see in the world, whether it's the climate crisis, the crisis of economic inequality, the crisis of racial injustice, the crisis of planetary limits, they all are not individual problems. They're a recognition. It's a recognition that each of these problems are connected. And, you know, and when we say connected, we begin then to say, how are they connected? Well, they're connected because they're connected through an economic system and a political system which reinforces and replicates those injustices. And we can say that that system is not something that is of this moment. You can trace this system back in its various formulations through this century and previous centuries. Many of us argue it's a way of looking at, for example, of understanding, particularly for Western Europe, maybe even more so, is understanding the role from slavery to colonialism, to imperialism, to neoliberalism, to the climate crisis, and even understanding today the impacts of how COVID are playing out. And I think it's really important from a climate perspective, first of all, because for a long time, people understood climate and the climate crisis only in terms of this is about carbon. And if it's about carbon, then all we're interested in is about reducing carbon. And then it became, well, to reduce carbon, we should just look at the fossil fuel industry. And our job is to reduce or shut down or close down the fossil fuel industry. And of course, much of the campaigning has been largely around reducing fossil fuel industry, but it never answered the question, well, why is it that $1.5 trillion more dollars has been invested in the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Agreement? Why is it that the fossil fuel industry is actually expanding, even as we know more and more about the climate crisis? Why is it that new, even existing fossil fuel reserves would bust our carbon budget and would breach not just the 1.5, but the 2-degree guardrail like 5 times over? And yet we're finding more and more new forms of dirty energy. Why is that the fossil fuel industry expanding? You can only understand the fossil fuel industry if you begin to understand the economic system and which supports it. So that was like a very logical way of like beginning to understand the climate crisis through this systems lens. But in itself, it also didn't answer the question, because, you know, the conclusion that many in the climate movement then drew was, well, if it's a system change issue, then all we have to do is create a new system. We have to move from the fossil fuel system to a renewable energy system. And without, again, understanding the questions about, well, what would that mean? Could you actually have a renewable energy system based on an economy which was based on fossil fuels? What would you do about half the world's population who don't have access to energy, clean electricity or clean cooking? What do you do about energy poverty in the global north? What do you do about the material use that the renewable energy will need? The huge new extraction of minerals and metals. And only when you begin to look at it through a system change lens, you begin to get to the real question, which is the more profound question. So what is energy for? What energy do we need? How much do we need it for? And what should it be? What is socially useful energy? And who owns that energy? How do we share it out? And I think that's where the lens of system change goes from being an abstract idea to a very, very important tool for how we begin to look at this face of this multiple crisis. I think the second thing for me is, so, you know, yes, system change therefore joins the dots. It joins the dots between all of the crises that we see around the world. But I think also very, very importantly, what system change does is not just talk about what is the problem. System change also then provides you with the basis talking about what is the vision, like what is the alternative. And I think that for a long time, you know, for much of the climate movement, who'd spend years and years and decades saying it's a problem, but never actually saying to people, here are the solutions, here are the transformative solutions that would remedy. So what it did was create either climate doom, we're all doomed, there's no hope, or it reinforced some of the worst ideas, because what it did is it disempowered people, it alienated people, it made them politically sort of bereft of any agency, because it said these are problems so vast they're nothing to do with you, right? These are problems that are going to be only solved by governments or by scientists or by some miraculous technological answer. So to me, system change is all of the issues that Jagoda talks about, how, you know, we look at the world and look at the planetary limits and look at all those. But just as important is the very human dimension. It tells us the story of how we get here. It tells us the vision of how we get beyond it. And it allows us to begin to conceptualize the political framework of the demands which will engage people to change the system to an alternative system. Now, we have to spell out, because often I think that's the missing part, and I'm sure we'll go on to discuss it. We often say we want system change, not climate change, but then we stop. And when you say to people, tell me what system change, we stumble without having an answer that the system change that we want is a socially just one, is within planetary limits. It's guaranteeing everybody the right to a dignified life. It says these are the fundamental foundations that absolutely every citizen in the world should be able to have, of health and education, of housing, of guaranteed income, of social protection. So it begins to move it away from simply being a question about fossil fuels or carbon to a much broader question about what is the economy for? What kind of world do we want to live in? What is our relationship with each other? And I think that's where, you know, why it's such a critical lens and really important for us to understand the system change lens and to own it and to really populate it with depth.
Dobrý večer. Also from my side, I'm very happy to be here part of this group. Many thanks to Josef Patočka for having set up this panel. And hopefully, I live in Vienna, very close to the Czech Republic. I always feel a bit bad because I don't know very much about Vienna, about the Czech Republic, the struggles. But it might change. Neklit Publishers and Jan Trinka in Prague, they are currently translating a book of mine and of colleague on the imperial mode of living into Czech, and maybe we have a chance to meet and to discuss. It's also going to be published in English and in other languages. By chance, I just mentioned it. It's not my argument for now. I'm finishing a paper on a sympathetic critique of the planetary boundaries framework Jagoda was referring to. We are 33 co-authors. And it's exactly in the line of Asad. We are trying to bring in critical social science and also the work on alternatives, how to live within the planetary boundaries, but not only to listen to the science, because it's also a social construct, planetary boundaries in a sense, but then also what are contributions. If you're interested in this, just let me know. In some weeks it will be finished. So I would like to start with Josef's first point. He wrote us, the techno-optimistic gradualism failed. I'm not so sure, Josef. I think that there is still a lot of techno-optimistic gradualism. The European Green Deal, we will talk about it in a moment. There is the whole move to electric automobiles, which is also very technic-optimistic, the geoengineering dynamics and so on, the sustainable development goals, if you like. But also, and this is now my point with the system change issue, even within Fridays for Future, you have, at least in Germany and Austria, you have a strong current, and they believe this and they defend it, of a green economy perspective, because they think system change is about the greening of the economy. So we need to be very precise, and I'm very happy that Asad and Jagoda already went a bit further, that it must be beyond even a fossil fuel or renewable, if you like, a change and phase out of fossil fuels. So if we talk about system change, we have to understand better what is the system about. And I would start, the system is capitalism. Capitalism in the sense Jagoda was mentioning of in intersectional forms of oppression, of power relations. And in my word, the system is the imperial mode of production and living. It's a constant reliance of our everyday lives, of our economies on the cheap resources and the cheap labor power of elsewhere, very much of the global south, not only of the global south. If I live in Austria and the Czech Republic, Slovakia are around the corner, but even within our countries. But my point here is the system still, the capitalist system still has a lot of acceptance within the society. We have, just to give an example, the so-called consumer citizen gap. The citizens are aware of climate problems. The citizens, as citizens, people are aware that we are really in trouble, that we have the multiple crises Asad was referring to. But making their living, they need, in many cases, they need to rely on the imperial mode of living. They need to rely on automobiles, on specific forms of production and consumption. I don't want to defend this, but I come from Antonio Gramsci, his theory of hegemony, to understand how the system, the capitalist system, is also creating consent, material consent among people. More maybe in societies that are material richer, but I would say also around the world. And we have to address this. This is just to open. So what is then the system change about? You already mentioned so many aspects. I come from a tradition which is called political ecology, a critical current, if you like, within studies on society, nature relations. And we have the very important concept of provisioning systems. Provisioning system means how today and how into the future our forms of mobility, housing, clothing, communication, interaction are organized, how these nature-society relations are organized. And the dynamics today is at the material basis, very much fossil fuel-based. I don't want to go into detail, you already did, but it's also capitalistically organized, not exclusively, but the dynamics to organize our forms of mobility, of clothing, of food, of communication, etc., housing. Yeah? Look at the housing crisis in many cities is pushed by capital accumulation, by profit interest, etc., etc. And how to change this? And we know already a lot. We know how to organize an agriculture, which is not industrial agriculture, which is not the food from nowhere, the term from Philip McMichael, but which is a regional, biological food, and also produced under socially accepted conditions. So my point here is the system should be or can be understood as a conjuncture, as an interfacing of provisioning systems and how to change the logics of these provisioning systems. And then it comes to a point, Jagoda already mentioned the term, I work on this since many years. We need a different understanding of well-being. The well-being today for many people, in a very hegemonic sense, is to have more, to grow. The three answers to the current crisis from the establishment is growth. A bit greener or less greener. So the degrowth movement and the degrowth perspectives puts on the fore that it's not the growth per se. Of course, we need better educational systems. We need better health systems. But the capitalist growth imperative is in many respects the problem. In the UK, you know this much better than I in Austria, where you have where the kind of the neoliberal privatization strategies were much more implemented. So then we have to talk, you already mentioned, an alternative form of well-being. And if you like, a critique of capitalism means to question private property, to question these enormous accumulated capital, which means also power. I don't have an exclusive class perspective, don't get it wrong. But if we talk about the fossil fuel industry, Asad already said, we have to talk about a materialized power in the financial markets, in the fossil fuel industry, which we have to acknowledge without weakening us. Very important what Asad said, that for a long time it was disempowering, to look at the world, and now with all the anti-fossil struggles, we get a change in perspective. So we call this, Markus and I, a solidary mode of living, not an imperial mode of living, to acknowledge it's not only about energy provision and electricity provision. The renewable energy is very much in the sector of electricity still, but to have really a different material, a different metabolism, a social metabolism within nature. And to end my conclusion in the first round, to question private property, to question the accumulation imperative, not as an abstract question, but in the very concrete struggles. What you are doing in the Czech Republic is to question the ability and the strategies of fossil fuel capital in the Czech Republic. And only 3 brief elements for the introductory round. What we should insist is that we need a public sector, a stronger public sector. We will come also at the end to the Corona crisis and the experiences. A public sector which, per se, of course, we have a lot of intransparency. It's also a lot of power struggles in the public sector. But the logic of the public sector, in the first instance, is not profit-oriented. It's, if you like, use value-oriented. It's not exchange value-oriented. And we should think very carefully. And I live in Vienna, the tradition of the Red Vienna. We just had elections a week ago. And the Social Democrats refer to the tradition of the Red Vienna, where we have still a lot of a very strong public sector. The second is, just to name it, forms of solidarity economy. To acknowledge that in the agricultural sector and other sectors, we have already forms of a post-capitalist economy where people really want to engage and want to make something differently. And I finish with this. A recent debate which came up with the Foundational Economics Collective, a group in the UK, which insists of the importance of infrastructure, of the preconditions of our life. So the well-being is not the car, is not the Rolex, is not the fancy food. It's the very infrastructure of our everyday life. How we move, how we are educated, how can we eat, and what is the basic of our life. And I think this is also a cornerstone. Some call it infrastructure socialism. I know that it's a very difficult word probably in the Czech Republic, but I like it because infrastructure socialism implies to not the socialism in the authoritarian tradition, of course, but to create the societal infrastructures, the conditions of our lives, of our well-being from a public perspective and not from a private perspective. And I think this is also a very important cornerstone for system change. Thank you.
Thank you all for the introductory answers to the first questions. I also wanted to mention to the audience that there is the possibility to ask questions, which we will have the time to get to at the last part of the debate. You can post them either into the Q&A box in the Zoom or also on Facebook below the stream, and we will then take them to our guests. My next question, which is you already mentioned a lot of important aspects of what a system change would mean or entail. Ulrich has mentioned the problems with infrastructures and with provisioning systems. Jagoda was also mentioning the degrowth movement and the critical role of the growth dynamic in fueling the ecological crisis. Asad, you have already mentioned, which I think is also an important aspect, the material footprint and the material impacts of the transition to renewables in terms of the mining and the materials that are necessary, and what I'm trying to get to is the question of we are already seeing some transition, some kind of transformation. There is clearly in terms of like electromobility, typically we are seeing that the system that we have today is somehow changing its energy basis. Also, switching from coal to gas, which is beginning to be a problem in Czech Republic. That the question is, how can we make sure in like campaigning in political work that that we include this aspect of justice, of the justness and equitability of the transition, of the transformation into our work. Also because like the example with gas shows that when we, for example, campaign and we create a lot of pressure against one bad thing, which is coal, but it's clearly not automatic. It's not, we cannot take for granted that it will be replaced by renewable energy system that provides energy to everyone on some equitable basis. So how can we make sure that the transition doesn't even deepen some of the inequalities and injustices that we see globally and also in Europe? And on a positive note, how do we in concrete work and in concrete campaigns for changes can make sure that the infrastructural changes like the switch from coal to renewables are enhancing also the other goals? How to think systemically in terms of practical politics? And maybe we can start with Ulrich this time and then proceed the other way around than last time. But maybe I would allow myself to ask you to be brief, please, so that we have enough time for all the questions and also the inputs from the audience. Thank you very much.
I would be aware that the first question was the most, or probably always three, the first comprehensive one, and I'll be very much shorter than in the first intervention. So I just finished a research project with colleagues here in Austria on the role of trade unions and workers in the automotive sector and in a process of social ecological transformation. And what we figured out, among many other things, I just focus on the aspect of just transition. The workers, most of all, want job security. This is the just transition. They don't want that the transition takes place on their backs because they know that capital plays them out against others. We have now in Steyr, in an Austrian city, a huge debate because MAN will replace its factories towards relocate towards Krakow and others. The first point is they want it must be just, but they don't insist necessarily in the job they have. There is a willingness, because they also know that there's climate change. In the automotive sector, there's a willingness to change to other sectors, but in a secure way. Not that their wages are lower, that they are kind of neoliberalized, that they lose the collective bargaining power and so on. So what, for example, the Green New Deal in the UK or in the US focus the job guarantee. Yeah, this is a core aspect for workers and this is also a result of our research. In Austria, for example, the ÖBB, the Austrian Railways, yeah, they now provide for whole Europe the night trains, yeah, because the other companies will not. And it's a very proud thing. And many workers, if you train them, if you offer them also good working conditions, they would even go from the automotive sector to the railway construction, just to give you an example. But this is key. The second is how not to deepen injustice. And at the European level, at the EU level, to be more precise, yeah, at the EU level, the pressure must also go to the regional politics, to the structural funds, to secure resources to those regions who will lose, who need to lose. And we have now you might have followed this in Germany, the coal compromise, that a lot of money goes to the two regions, the Rhineland the region in the east. I don't know the translation. This is also key. It's a public, it's a societal question. It's not a question of the company and of the workers. A just transition is a societal challenge, and funds must come from the governments, from the European Union. The third aspect, and then I finish to be short, is how not to deepen global inequality. This is a thing which strikes me. Of course, when I work on the improvement of living, I just finished a research proposal for the EU to do research on the lithium industry in Bolivia and Chile, and what does it mean when now the electrification of the European automotive industry goes on. So the first I would suggest, I would recommend, I don't want to be paternalistic. The first I think is necessary for the movements, for the politicians to consider that there is another side of the coin. Because usually this is left out. Usually the world is left out. So now we go for the electrification of the automotive sector, and we need lithium, and we need copper and whatever. And the first we can do as movements, as NGO activists, as researchers, is to insist that there is another side of the coin. And then, and because it's denied, it's mainly denied up to date. And this is the first step then to think in strategies. I leave it here.
So I definitely would concur with everything that Ulrich just said. I just maybe adding another dimension to it, and I feel like I focus on some of the more the foundational questions rather than the political vision, which I'm much more would like to always speak about. But Ulrich's done a great job in terms of that. I think first, when we talk about system change, I think it's important for us to just have some concrete realities. So first of all, all of us, we have all got this commitment to, keep temperatures well below 1.5 degrees. So we should know that when we're talking about the existing carbon budget, that's about 340 gigatons that's left. If you take out all of the techno fixes, the unproven technologies, the corporate sort of cross your fingers and something will come in solution. The reality is, at best, at 66% chance of it, we've got less than 10 years. So we've got this challenge of preventing a breach of this critical guardrail, because we can already see around the world, when we look at what the impacts of just at 1.1 degree warming, of the killer floods, droughts, famines that are wrecking and destroying the lives and livelihoods of millions and millions of people, of how it compounds all the existing inequalities. That's really important for us to put a time frame and say, that's our challenge. But of course, that is not just the only challenge, right? The challenge of inequality, both to the global south and also within the global north, is absolutely profound. If we just look at since 1990 to now, the level of poverty in the world has not changed at all. 3.5 billion people live on less than $5 a day. That's not the basis of saying that they have the right of dignity. I mean, we'd be talking about anything between 10 to 15 to even closer to $20 to be able to guarantee people the right to health and housing and education, all the very basic fundamentals. And that has got to be very, very clear to us. I mean, I wish that every climate activist had just on their wall the picture of the banner that the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests who protested in France on the imposition of a carbon tax had. And their banner said, the elites worry about the end of the world. We ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month. And until we embed that question, that tackling global inequality and inequality within our own countries is as important as tackling the global climate crisis, we're never going to win the social license for the transformation. And Ulrich is absolutely right that when we talk about the just transition, we don't simply talk about it in terms of, this is about, exiting people who are working in the fossil fuel industry out of the fossil fuel industry. Because again, we're not just talking about those individual workers, and we can be generous or not generous. In Germany, they've been more generous with the fossil fuel workers, giving them early pensions, etc. It's also about what does it mean for the communities and the economies when those fossil fuel jobs are no longer there. So what jobs replace them? And we know that the answer isn't the neoliberal model, which is basically a gig economy, insecure work, 0-hour contracts, low pay, non-unionized. It is decent and safe and secure jobs. And workers have long been demanding that. I'll give you an example. Back in the UK, in the 1970s, workers in the military, in producing armaments, put forward a plan. The Lucas plan in the 1970s said the answer to redundancies is a new economy, is retooling those same factories and those same skills to build kidney dialysis machines, to build wind turbines. In the 1970s, workers were saying, we want to just transition out of these economies. If you look at workers in the mining industry around the world, they all say, we do not want to be down extracting fossil fuels. We don't want to be in the most dangerous industry. We don't want to be destroying our health and polluting our own environment and destroying water and land and destroying our communities. But if the answer is starvation, then of course we're forced into that. That raises a much more profounder question of just transition than is simply about workers simply in the fossil fuel industry. And that's where I think we've got to talk about, we're talking about a just transition of the energy system, of energy and food being a public good, guaranteeing people the right to energy and food. We're talking about a system that we have to say to people, this is about, health and education and housing, guaranteeing a job. This is about your well-being. And whatever word we want to use, whether it's well-being, dignified life, these are, they sound so radical at this moment. And one of the things that neoliberalism has done, the last decade has sort of done to all of us, it's taken away our ability to be able to imagine an alternative and forget that this system that is created was constructed. And if it was constructed, it can be deconstructed and some alternative can be put forward. And even and you don't have to be the most radical person. Nobody's asking people to suddenly take on this radical vision. And I like Ulrich, I know that words have meaning, and particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, saying socialist or public has connotations. But if we remember, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights said, we guarantee these things to every citizen in the world: health, education, housing, the right to secure employment. All of these rights were set out over 70 years ago. Our challenge is to be able to realize them. So when I think we need to talk about just transition, we need to talk about it in a much more profound way. We need to move away from it simply about being limited to the factories. And of course, that brings in all the questions that we talked about in the first answer, right? It's about actually asking the question, what does GDP, what does growth actually deliver for the majority of people? Look, we have half the world living on less than $5 a day. We have increasing economic inequality in our own countries, right? The richest 1% now own 3 times as much wealth as the bottom 60% of the world. And the middle bit of the people are not absolutely wealthy. They're mainly struggling to basically survive. We have not benefited. Even during this 1 year of COVID, the wealth of the top 1% has increased by 1/3. Whilst most ordinary people are struggling how to maintain their jobs and feed their families during lockdowns and with all of what that has meant in terms of impact. Of course, the answer isn't to say, well, we're going to sacrifice the global south to be able to do that. And that's where, we have to recognize that the economies of the global north has been racialized and gendered capitalism. It has been about the exploitation of people and resources for profit. You have to, again, you don't have to be radical. You just simply have to say, if you accept environmental limits, if you accept that there are planetary limits that if we go beyond create unimaginable consequences for all of us, limiting that and then sharing that requires a very different paradigm and a very different way of looking at what the economy is for and how we as a society are constructed. Now, look, some people, we've fallen into this trap of ignoring what this means by when they talk about renewable energy, right? And as Ulrich said, suddenly we're saying the car industry is saying the answer isn't to change your consumption. It's to simply say, we'll put electric batteries. The answer to this isn't going to be found in electric batteries. The answer actually is going to be found in much more profound demands that our movement should be making. We should be making demands about that our public transport should be universal, should be renewable energy, and it should be free, right? We should be making much more profound demands about reshaping our economy. Look, food. We know that we're about to enter another food pandemic. We already have 2 billion people around the world who face issues around hunger. We have 1 billion people who face issues around obesity. We can feed the world 3 times over, and our food system is constructed, again, industrial agribusiness, it's been constructed for profit of the biggest corporations, and is responsible for 1/3 of emissions. So whichever way you enter this question, if you want to enter it simply from a climate perspective and say, I don't care about people, I simply care about carbon, you come to the same conclusion. If you care about people and you enter it and say, I want to make sure that everybody has dignity and has a fair share of the world's resources and is able to live a dignified life, you come to the same conclusions. You can't separate the question about energy and food from the questions about how we live and about how a society guarantees those basics. Now, that feels like it's a really profound, well, that's beyond us. But we hit some hard barriers, right? Renewable energy. Just simply looking at energy, if we take it out of all of the other questions, we know that you cannot produce enough renewable energy to meet the energy needs of the world as it is. All of the increase in renewable energy is simply adding on to existing fossil fuels. It's not necessarily reducing fossil, because energy demand is increasing. Why? Because our economic system demands it. At the same time, we know that the impact of material use is one of the boundaries of the planet that we're breaching. So we're told a sustainable level of material use is about 50 billion tons a year. We're about to 88 now. We're going to head to about 170 billion tons within the next 20 to 30 years. So we're seeing a massive expansion of material use, knowing at the same time that breaches. So the answer isn't going to be, it's going to be different material. So it's not a technical answer. It's not an answer that, oh, if you substitute one thing for another, this will be the solution. And I think for too long we've allowed what I would call the so-called liberal part of the climate movement to tell everybody a lie, right? To tell everybody a lie that this would be the answer, and it's not the answer. And I think that's very, very important for us to do. And it's why, for example, the Czech Republic, like many other places, found themselves in this problem where if you say we want to end coal and you spend decades fighting against coal, they then go to gas, and then you fight decades going against gas, and then they go to renewable energy, destructive renewable energy, and then are we going to spend decades whilst at the same time we all know we've got 10 years. So even from a vision and a pragmatic point of view, it's impossible for us now to have transition. We need a much more radical transformation of our economy and of our society. And that doesn't mean you have to be radical or from the left. It actually just means that you care about yourself, your community, and the planet, and it leads you to the same conclusions. And I think that for us raises some really important questions, which I hope we're going to be able to discuss, which is, why have we as progressives not won the social license for this kind of transformation? And why is it that the right has won the license for a retrenching and a retreatment? Sorry, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Maybe passing to Jagoda.
Coming back to just transition, I agree it should not be looked at just this narrow transitioning of jobs in fossil fuel industry. And I think that's actually due to historic reasons and debates that was about just transition within trade union movements. And they're also going to more broader dimensions of the term. Some use also socially fair transition. Transitioning jobs in fossil fuel industry is actually the easiest part of it. And it will happen quickest in a way. I don't think anyone is going to, in Europe, to repeat kind of like closing of coal mines and coal industry all of a sudden and just lay off people, there will be some kind of job security or compensations for that. And even within European Green Deal, there is proposal for Just Transition Fund to support coal regions in Europe. There are not that many coal regions in Europe. Some of them are in Czech Republic, and I know that there is debate how to transition region as such into a new type of economy so that it's not so coal dependent. Bankwatch, which is an environmental organization, is doing projects in Eastern Europe to support such regions, to find kind of new plans to transition a local regional economy. So this is happening, and this is going to happen, I would say, relatively easy, probably not as quick as needed, but it will be done, and some money will be provided also by European Union from the fund. What is less likely to happen or harder to be implemented is transitioning to renewables in a way that doesn't, the cost of that transition is not paid by the poorest part of society. For instance, if you transition from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy, and if you, because of cost of transition, you increase the cost of electricity, for example, for households, that means that those who are poorer will not be able to afford to pay their bills. And we will increase energy poverty in Europe. This is something that was, in a way, happened in France with the taxation, and to avoid the similar kind of discontent and protests across Europe, there will be also some funding for that kind of projects that will eradicate energy poverty. I'm less optimistic about that than for the first case that I gave, because it will be harder to implement, it will be much more costly, and because the mechanism that Commission proposed was this just transition mechanism, the funding for that will come from the banks. So I expect it will be very neoliberal solution they propose, giving people loans for maybe insulating houses, putting solar collectors on the roofs and so on. And that will be useful for, let's say, kind of middle class people. But for the poorest part of society, those who cannot afford even that, to get a loan, they will not be able to access such support. And we see that already in some funding provided also by governments on national level, for when they, for instance, give you some subsidies to buy electric car. But even with subsidy, electric cars are still so high in price that those who cannot afford a car can of that price, that they will continue to buy very cheap the diesel car, which is like a second hand and so on. So this is something that we as activists should actually demand, that the cost of this transition, cost of clean energy, is not paid by the poorest part of society, but the richest. And the third element of it is the impact on global south. From perspective of what's happening in Europe in terms of new policies and Green Deal, European Green Deal, I would say this will be the hardest to address, because there is practically nothing there that is going to support transition in global south. So as environmental campaigners, as climate activists, we have to really bring this element into the debate, that we cannot have transition to clean energy in Europe on expenses of resource extraction in global south and impacts that this extraction will have there. So I'll stop here, and then we can move to other questions.
It's actually that the European Green Deal was exactly the topic that I wanted to get to, and I would turn the order of you speaking once again, and maybe I have to appeal at you to try to be brief, as we still want to give some time to the audience and not be here forever, even if the discussion up to now, I think, is very interesting for me. And the Green Deal is exactly for us also an issue. Like we've gotten into a situation when the outlines of European policy are already set, basically, for the coming decade, the critical decade that Asad has been talking about, when we need to really like slash emissions very fast if we want to keep under the 1.5 boundary. And so the parameters are basically set, and they don't look that great. But in countries like the Czech Republic or Poland, which are very like coal-dependent countries, the criticism of the Green Deal, the attacks on the Green Deal are coming from very opposite side of the debate than the environmental movement or the they are coming from the industry, the ruling politicians who say this is going to ruin us economically, it's impossible, and it's very hard to you know, this pushes us also to defend something that we know is not great in the face of policy proposals that are outright horrible. So how do we deal with this dilemma? Maybe this is something that Jagoda can also relate to, because she knows the situation in Croatia, and I can imagine that the debate there can be quite similar. So I would pass the word to you again. How should we approach this conundrum?
Yeah, I can maybe start with the Brussels perspective and then give a maybe Croatian or Eastern European kind of angle to it. So indeed, I think that's hot debate among civil society organizations in Brussels, in Europe, how critical you should be, because it's not good enough from our perspective. But then again, it could be much worse, right? Because when you look where the previous commission was in terms of climate policies and green policies, this is space shuttle in comparison. Unfortunately, it's still not good enough. It's a bit too little too late from the perspective of what needs to be done, and that's scary part of it. But at least it's something, right? So Friends of the Earth, for instance, was one of more critical organizations in Europe. When you look these Green 10 like organizations across networks across Europe, I would say we are on the more critical side of the spectrum. And then there was also debate about which language you use, because you don't want to kill it. You want to actually make it more ambitious. And industry on the other side is really want to kill it, right? Mm. But also when you even talk with people who are in the position of power to make these policies, they need this kind of more radical angle on side that ask for more ambition. Because if there is no radical demand there, then industry is going to pull all the policies into their side. So we have to be there to demand more, to demand faster action, more ambitious action, more just action, something that action that will actually take into account European impacts in global south. So all these elements have to be there, and we have to bring these voices to the policy debate in order for the Green Deal, European Green Deal, to be more ambitious. Otherwise, it will be greenwashed and watered down. And this is what we see now. The debate is about that, you know, like the cost, slowing down ambition on climate, asking for more money for that, putting in gas as solution, hydrogen, and actually linked with the gas and so on. Or transitioning just to electric cars, but not maybe to what, like just Asad gave example on free and accessible clean public transportation. So, you know, like these voices should come from us, and we should demand them across Europe. Now, coming to, let's say, Eastern Europe perspective, I'm always frustrated being Croatian, because, you know, like all governments are usually very backwards in that regard, and they always want to do as least possible. Firstly, Eastern Europe is not that poor, so that we cannot do this transition. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's true. I mean, I think I can say that, but we have to be much more kind of like responsible, I would say. So debate there should be, okay, we can do it actually, and we can do it quickly. And there is going to be some funding also coming through these processes. So we can also have some funding for it. And actually, and that's, I think it's a link with maybe debate later about recovery post-corona. What is now debated in European Union is the new multi-financial framework, so the new 7-year budget for European Union and the recovery package. So that basically European Union decided to increase the budget to help post-corona kind of recession, and at the same time link it with digitization and green policies. So green transition. How green this transition will be will depend on how much we can push industry to do it. So if our voices are not there, that will be less green than and less just than it's needed. And precisely next 6 months, we will have all national governments in European Union preparing their recovery packages, their plans for recovery of economy, and shift to digitalization and greening of economy. So what is going to be there is fundamentally going to impact next 10 years of development in terms of what's going to be funded, but much more and for much longer period in terms of consequences of that funding. Because if gas is still there, if fossil fuels are still there, we will not be able to actually have quick transition in the next 10 years. On the other hand, money will be there, and this is unique opportunity, actually, historic opportunity to push as much as we can that we defossilize our economy for the start. Okay, I'll stop here. Of course, this investment is linked with the new kind of growth circle, but that's a much bigger debate, I would say.
Asad, to you.
So just to, you know, I spent about 10 years working around the UN climate talks, and I was always shocked, even right to the end, how what we would call the mainstream environment movement, with the honorable exception of Friends of the Earth, would enter this question at every level, knowing that we're talking about greenwashing, we're talking about that the responses from the state or the European Union is not, doesn't meet the urgency, doesn't meet the science requirement, doesn't do all the things. And they get locked into this question of, well, we have to be pragmatic, because this is about gradual change. This is about us negotiating within the rooms about what we can achieve, and ignoring the reality of what that means in terms of the consequences, the people and their lives and the livelihoods that they're sacrificing. So I don't disagree that you have to fight to make, you know, these reformist demands better. But the most important thing is you've got to first have the truth about what you want, and then to be able to say, okay, now we're going to engage in a fight around this, but to be always understand that the fight is about us moving to somewhere that we want, rather than working within the parameters that the state sets and then saying this is the only parameters. So we're talking about making something which we know won't solve the crisis, doesn't tackle inequality, doesn't provide the resources for the transition that is needed for the poorest people, doesn't protect the poorest from the consequences of these crises and these changes in our economy, and saying, well, let's make that as best as we can. I think that's a fundamental dereliction, and I think it goes to the heart of that within our mainstream environment movement, as in with mainstream civil society, there is an acceptance that of the parameters of the dominant economic system. People are talking about basically, let's make neoliberalism a little bit less worse than it is. And they're only able to do that because ultimately they don't pay the price for that, for the result of those ineffectual decisions. So I would say our job is to tell the truth, to raise the bar, to demand the impossible, and I will quote you in this. I'll say, you know, and that's our job. And then to using that, then we fight into what is this European Green New Deal, because our critique then is twofold. Our critique is what's needed, and then our critique is how do we move from where we are to where we want to get, rather than a critique is about only working within the parameters. Then we're only talking about a small, can we get a little bit more money for the EU budget on the transition? Can we get this, you know, instead of a 20-year transition, can we make it 15-year transition? Can we, an accepting of the ultimate frame that the EU's global Green New Deal accepts, which is basically this argument that we've got a carbon budget to 2050, that somehow we've got some technological answers that are going to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and allow us to continue to polluting. And I would just say the last 30 years have shown that that approach has meant absolutely nothing. From the 1970s onwards, when people first knew the climate crisis was here, through to the moment of the 1990s when the Earth Summit has taken place, this insider approach of pragmatism has taken us to the brink of planetary disaster. And that's because people have not had a radical vision, have not had a political grounding, don't understand what power is, don't understand how our economy works and the vested powerful interests, and don't understand how we build power and counter power to their power. And that's what I think is the most crucial. Once you've got that, then I'm all for being pragmatic about the kind of transitional fights that you need to have, because those fights are about building power. They're not about necessarily about winning short-term measures within that, because we know that them are not going to deliver what we need.
Great, thank you very much, both of you. I'm invited as a social scientist, and also, as you already hopefully noticed, I'm an activist scholar. I understand myself quite close to social movements. But I would like to kind of change a bit the perspective, but recognizing what was already said. In June, I published a small book, it's in German, and I further developed my work on what I call green, with many others, green capitalism. And I reflected on the European Green Deal. And the one thought, Antonio Gramsci, I already mentioned him, a thinker, co-founder of the Communist Party in Italy. He was deputy of parliament in Italy. He proposed 100 years ago a very, very important concept to understand, from my perspective, the European Green Deal. He proposed the concept of a passive revolution. A passive revolution for Gramsci is a move of the powerful forces, the politically and economic powerful forces, given problems, in brackets, climate change, environmental problems, ecological crisis, but without giving up their power, but reconfiguring their power and looking for solutions, in brackets, for solutions for the most urgent problems. And so my thought in my article is that the European Green Deal is part, not a conscious, of course, now it's an analytical perspective. It's not von der Leyen's perspective. The European Green Deal is part of a dissent among European capital fractions, European politicians, how to deal with the ecological crisis. And I propose 4 projects. I'm very brief, Joseph, don't worry. 4 projects. There is an anti-ecological project, the Trumpian, the far-right project, the AfD project in Germany. They don't care about climate change. It's just wrong. And then there is what I call the authoritarian green capitalist version. A green capitalism which comes from above, which combines with authoritarian proposals. For example, it's anti-cooperative. It's the trade unions don't play a role, NGOs don't play a role. And then a third project I call a progressive green capitalism. And this is, I would say, the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal is an elites, economic and political elites who understood that we have a problem, that we are in trouble. Their response is, because it's part of a passive revolution, must be in line with dominant interests, but also among the elites there are struggles, the automotive industry, the energy producers, etc. And the fourth project, of course, would be a radical social ecological transformation, Asad, or we are outlining, or we outlined in the first one. So my point is, you said criticize, adopt, or radicalize the European Green Deal. What we need to understand is where are the entry points of the 10 concrete proposals, the 10 strategies from the European Green Deal, where alliances with these progressive green capitalists, they won't solve the problems, but they might be allies in particular questions, because if not, we maintain here are the movements, here are the goods, and there are the bads. And my point is, I hope you got it, there are not the bads per se, but there are concerned elites. They stick to the ecological modernization perspective, pro-capitalist, pro-growth. Jagoda already said it at the end. It's a pro-growth, it's a pro-competitiveness approach, of course. But to look very carefully in the strategies and then in the different fields, food, housing, and etc., where are potential allies and where this European Green Deal can be, in a sense, radicalized. Yeah, this is a kind of the main idea.
Thank you very much. I think that brings us, this issue of alliances already brings us very well to the last question that I will pose, and maybe if we can make it in the next 10 minutes, we will be able to have those 30, 40 minutes also for the audience. The final question that I had was, it is clear that COVID-19 and the subsequent economic crisis, which we will probably only see the full of it in the coming months, it's clear that it has destabilized the world, and it's clear that there are some openings, opportunities presenting themselves. And so my question was, what should we do differently than in the past 10 years, let's say, since the last financial crisis? Also, what should we do differently than in the last financial crisis? Because it's clear that that also was an opening which we probably shouldn't be particularly satisfied with how our side of the struggle has used that opening 10 years ago. So what can we do better this time in terms of practical politics? You surely are thinking about that also in your own work. We can start this time with Ulrich, go the next way around. So yeah, that's the question. What is to be done?
Yeah, very good and very crucial. I'm always saying that last December, we wouldn't have imagined that the climate crisis question would get again off the political agenda so quickly. It was not imagined, and suddenly we had the Corona crisis. So I start with a brief remark, and then we can deepen in the discussion. I use in the book I just mentioned a concept which was proposed by Naomi Klein, the Canadian feminist publisher, of Corona capitalism. And as the green capitalism argument, it wants to point that probably, if there is not a strong resistance and good alternatives, probably the Corona crisis also will be dealt with in line with dominant interests, which is the pharmaceutical industry, which are the white deal, as van der Leyen says, told us. But I leave it aside because we want to talk about alternatives. My point is that we already learned, for example, in Austria and Germany 10 years ago in the financial crisis, the scrapping bonuses, the money you got for scrapping your car and you bought a new car, yes, you got 2,000 euro, 2,500 euro. This didn't go through this time. So there was already an interesting politicization that, or here in Austria, the Green Ministry of the Environment, she linked the bailout for Austrian airlines with to impede short distance flights, yeah, or too cheap tickets. So there is something going on, but it's of course it's too weak. And I would say what we can learn from the current crisis is the neoliberal orthodoxy that the state is only the state that makes the rules and the economy is about private capital. This is not true. The state has to jump in and the state has to secure with a lot of funds the well-being of people in a crisis. And what I started with the public sector, with insisting on the public sector. And this has a potential. Of course, currently it's the old strategy. In a crisis, the losses are socialized, and in a good situation, the profits are privatized. Yeah, we are in the game. The profits are privatized. The losses are socialized. This is the current situation. But there is now a public debate that obviously the state can intervene even against capital, against the automotive industry, against the airline industry, and this can be taken up by the climate movement. Secondly, the everyday life, what I call the imperial mode of living, is irritated. It's not any longer cool to fly for 20 euro from Vienna to Mallorca or to Barcelona to drink a coffee or to make some shopping, but it's an open terrain to maintain the crisis and to push for the crisis of the air industry, yeah, and to really to leave them on the ground. And the third aspect, and then I finish, is Asad already said it, the experience that in a situation of a crisis, the industry can push for some conversion. I don't want to go too far, but the fact that some industries, automobile producers and others, were suddenly producing other things which are socially more meaningful, which were important in the health crisis, is also an important learning process. And then to link this to the experience, to the demand of the climate movement, the climate adjustment movement, this is important. I finish with this sentence. I don't say that this takes place. I just argue there are potential learning processes when struggles, alternatives, proposals are heard and are pushed through. I would say for now, we should prepare for corona capitalism, but it depends on power relations, on struggles and good initiatives, whether we can open up these learning processes doors.
So it's been Joseph? Yeah.
So
I mean, actually, it's not simply 2008, right? The financial crisis. If you look at the crises that have happened in the previous century, right, we as progressives have to ask ourselves a profound question: why we lost, right? The 1970s, you remember the energy and food crisis, well before many of you were born. You know, we see the victory of neoliberalism, right? We see this is when corporate globalization is supercharged, right? Whole-scale global privatization, the opening up of economies of the global south, the domination of the food system by industrial agribusiness. We see, you know, what is seen as the victory of neoliberalism in that moment. And in 2008, you know, remember the headlines, even in The Economists and the mainstream: is capitalism dead? Is capitalism in crisis? And what happens, right? In the global north, we see a decade of austerity, of public sector cuts, of cuts to social protection, of creation of a deregulated labor economy. And we see the rise of the far right and populist right, taking the critique of globalization and taking the critique of the left behind and weaponizing it in terms of a mantra around walls and fences and a rise of xenophobia. So I totally agree with Ulrich. The reality that in this moment of multiple crises, that the answer is going to be something that is better is not a foregone conclusion. In fact, the reality is it's probably more likely that we are going to see a far more authoritarian and disaster capitalism than we're seeing now. But it also creates a window of opportunity. And Milton Friedman, you know, who's the architect of neoliberal capitalism, you know, very famously said this quote, and I think all of us should have this pinned to our walls, right? He said, "Only in a crisis actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available, and until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. So the question we have is twofold. What are ideas that we have that are to deal with this, to make the moment the politically impossible? And then secondly, how do we create the power to make them the politically inevitable? Now, you know, of course, in the global north, you know, we had the climate strikers, we had Extinction Rebellion. It was the year of climate, you know, movements and mobilizations, largely because everybody panicked after the 1.5 report in 2018, etc. But you're forgetting that in January of this year, and it feels like years ago now, right, pre-COVID, you saw whole-scale mobilizations and protests in Chile, right, connecting the fight against economic injustice, climate, against patriarchy, where people were saying this is not about 30 pesos, it's about 30 years. You had huge protests on the streets of Iraq talking about economic inequality. In Sudan, in Algeria, you had millions on the streets in the subcontinent. All of that social inequality is actually worsened, right? The existing economic inequality for the majority of the people is worsened. The ILO already says we've lost 420 million jobs in the global already. It's some people estimate that half of all jobs in the global south will be lost as a result of the corona pandemic. This is not like 2008, where capitalism was able to refinance the banks on the backs of working people and say that's the solution. There is a much more profound crisis of the economic system going on. And if we see corona as being the curtain raiser for this global global crisis, like, let's look at what the reality has been. The pandemic hit as a global pandemic. Countries competed with each other for vital health resources, right? There was no global response to this pandemic. Supply chains shut, left workers destitute in the global south without any support. You saw migrant workers walking thousands of kilometers. You saw the dead laying unburied in Ecuador at the same time as the Ecuadorian government was paying unsustainable debt repayments to global banks and corporations. The reality is, for the global south, what was left was a public sector which our policies had deliberately destroyed, right? In Germany, they have 28 doctors per 10,000 citizens. In places like Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso, they had 0.01. Why? Because we insisted that the economies of the global south cut public expenditure, didn't invest in social protection. So there is a huge economic crisis coming around, and people are not going to be willing to sit on their hands and say we're going to be sacrificed. At the same time as there's this climate crisis going on, within that is our ability to be able to provide something different. Now, we know that the majority of the handouts that have happened have been handouts to the big corporations. But as Ulrich said, something very profound happened in the global economies of the North. Right, our governments ripped up the rule book of the last 10 years that they told us it was impossible for us to intervene in the economy. We can't protect jobs. We can't invest in public services. And what did they do? They invested in public services, in the health, of course, to protect their economy first and foremost, and then the health of their citizens second. But they've done that, and people, ordinary people around all across Europe, have come to a realization. What is really important? Our health systems are very, very important. Actually, our communities are very, very important for our well-being. Actually, they've started to ask more profound questions. What is work for? How much should we work? There are real profound conversations going on about what is going to be rebuilt out of the ashes of this broken economy. And that's our opportunity. And that's our opportunity to be much more visionary and much more, and raise the transformation and have transformation demands. As War on Want, we're working with movements in the global south on creating what is a radical global Green New Deal that centers the requirements of the fair shares at 1.5, but also recognizes the crisis of neoliberal and capitalist inequality, and recognizes what the impact of COVID and the recession has been, but also recognizes that what ties all of these things is a system of exploitation of people and resources of the global south to benefit the global north. Yes, ultimately, we benefit, as no matter how we live in the global north, we are beneficiary, but we are not the ones that are most benefited. So we all know, you all saw that famous champagne glass, 10% of the world's population, 50% of global emissions. If you overlay that with income, you see the same 10%. Yes, they own 3 times as much wealth as the bottom 50%. But actually, when you look inside it, you see that the top 1% are the ones who are amassing most wealth and most income. So I think, there are huge questions for us to answer. But this is where, going back to the question that you asked at the beginning, our language has not got to be to people, this is about less. You're going to have less. Actually, we have to start talking about, you're going to have a better life. This is not, you are not going to be the ones that pay the price for this. We are going to create a society which meets your needs. And I think that means a profound change. It means winning social license. It means us as climate people centering economic justice and social justice demands. We're never going to win unless we do that. If we don't do that, we're going to be pitted against the labor movement. We're going to be pitted against demands around social and economic justice, and the right will win. And that's what, as Ulrich said, if you look at one part of the right is denialists, climate denialists. But the other part of the right says, you're right, there is a crisis. And the only thing that matters now is our tribe, is our walls and fences, is our nation state. We have to protect that. And we know that we're only going to win if we can rebuild solidarity and internationalism. And the way to do that is not to say it's either or. It's to say, if we're going to fight for a decent health system in our own country, we should fight for a global NHS. We can pay for that. If we're going to fight for public services in our own country, why can't we have public services everywhere? Because we can live connected. All of those are technically possible. They're all financially possible. They actually won't even cost a small percentage of the amount of money that is being given and is going to be handed over in the Corona stimulus package to rebuild the economy. In the next year and a half, this is the most critical moment, I think, for our movement, to build the movement of movements, to connect to these kind of demands and actually not be pragmatic, but be committed to telling the truth and having demands that tell us. And I'll just end by one thing. Even on looking at the corona, we took, one example, the vaccine, the so-called vaccines that are going to come out in terms of corona, right? Even if every single vaccine works, if everyone that they're testing, already 13% of the world's population, the richest 13 in the global north, they've taken over 60% of all the vaccines. They've already bought them. For the global south, there is going to be no hope of a vaccine at all until 2022, 23, 24. And the reality of the human cost is one where we are able to tell a much bigger story. There is going to be a world where either we have 2/3 of it dying and burning to protect a third, or we're going to have a world where we can all live more equitably, more fairly, and healthier and in a better well-being. And whatever language we use that connects us, I'm not interested in having dogmatic conversations about it has to be these frames. What matters is the political demands that underpin them. And I think that's our huge opportunity that rests in front of us.
Jagoda, your take on crisis as opportunity microphone.
Yes, thanks. Asad really brought lots of things that I want to respond, but I have no time. So maybe I'll just say a few things like this. Firstly, indeed, governments respond differently to this crisis than in 2008-9. And we should ask ourselves why. And the answer to that is probably because they got scared. They got scared of what they've seen in society developed into after 2009 in terms of radicalization, right-wing populism, protest, and so on. That's one thing. And second thing, they also have seen movements of the street, particularly young people marching and Yellow Vest in France. And when they combine the two, they say, okay, we have to this time prevent things getting even worse. So what does it tell us? It tells us that we can build power with people to force and influence mainstream politics and course of development. So that's one lesson learned, I would say, a very important lesson. How we can do that? Firstly, we should definitely develop our own narrative strategically, what we want, radical, understandable, and so on, and be able to communicate it out of our inner circle, because very often we talk to ourselves. Even on this panel, we all agree, more or less. I didn't see any big debate about conflicting opinion, but in real world, that's not so, you know? We have to be able to speak to people who don't share necessarily your opinion, and we have to be able to win them on our side. Primarily those who will be impacted the most, both by crisis and the consequence of climate change and so on. So this is what we haven't done so far. As a movement, we failed to do so because very often we focus on details of little difference among ourselves, of different tactics, instead of going out and talking to people on the streets. So that's the second lesson I would really like to share. And maybe third thing that I would like to say, because Asad brought also neoliberalism and global south and situation in Latin America. For us in Eastern Europe, I would say, we were afraid of maybe being in the public spot, demanding some of the policies or some of the more radical opinions because of the history of the region. It was very hard to do so. In my own country, Croatia, you could not talk about some measures because you will be attacked quite severely for defending the previous system. So we have this historical kind of heritage that it was so hard for us to maybe openly speak in public about some of the policies that we want to see. This is changing, I would say, last decade, particularly after 2008 crisis, and particularly now, we see even in Eastern Europe, we have green left politicians getting into parliaments, like in Croatia and so on. So now is the moment to bring back, or maybe better to say, to develop new green left politics and narrative, and actually go into public space with a better vision, with better policies that are going to be for benefit of everybody. Thanks, I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. We are now getting finally for the last, I would say, maximum of 20 minutes of debate into the, we have some interesting questions from the audience, and maybe also because of the time aspect, I would connect two of them into one, and I hope the people who post them will, because of them. One of them is, when we're talking about the transition, the ecological transition and also, can you hear me well? Yeah, okay. When we're talking about that, the transition cannot happen on the backs of the people in the global south in terms of all these aspects of green colonialism, as it's called. How can movement in the north, in these countries, actually build practical coalitions and solidarities with the movements in the global south? And maybe I would, maybe it would be best if I try to point these questions to concrete people, so that we save time. So this question probably I would ask you, Asad, in terms of like in Central Europe, especially like post-communist space, this is pretty hard also because we don't have that strong awareness of the colonial past of the Western civilization. how do we build these solidarities, and how do we also communicate them to our own societies in a way that leads to productive outcomes and not just feelings of resentment, which are playing into the cards of the far right quite often. What is your experience with this?
Absolutely. Look, you know, actually the history of, I would say, humanity has always been a profound social change has come when we've built solidarities with people, right? And it is eminently possible, and we can look at all the struggles through history and say, you know, whether it's been struggles against slavery, etc., a fundamental part of that has been the building of solidarity between impacted people and people who are not impacted, and finding common ground and building that solidarity. How do we do it in the climate crisis, right? Well, we know we can do it both in terms of impacts, because these impacts are already happening, but I think we could do it much more in a more profound way. So whether it's energy or food, look, food impacts people on a daily basis. And we know that we can have a food system which is healthier and can feed all the free world. And we know food poverty is a huge issue for more and more people, and particularly in the what we call the global south within the global north, right? With poorer communities within. I think there is a demands that we can make that connect those. Same around energy, right? Look, you know, it's not simply about, yes, of course, one part of our story is to tell about, look what the impacts are on communities in the global south, and that is about public awareness, right? But public awareness in itself is just awareness. Our conversation, of course, is about political education, to turn people into from passive consumers of that knowledge into activists who feel they've got some agency. And the way that you express that agency, of course, is to find demands that you can then direct them towards. And this is where I do think, you know, the demands around energy, for example, and us saying, look, we should be demanding warm homes for everybody, right? Retrofitting every home. We should be demanding that we tackle energy poverty. Absolutely. Is or also the demands, of course, in the global south. People in the global south aren't saying that they don't want energy. They want energy. They just don't want a destructive energy. And I think there is links that we can start to make between how people feel exploited in Central and Eastern Europe, and live in terrible conditions of environmental injustice, and build solidarities between communities. We've done it, of course, with coal-affected communities, where the communities there have made solidarity with other communities, and it's the same companies, it's the same multinationals who are doing X to you are doing Y to me. I think there are very real, concrete ways that you begin to develop this solidarity, but it operates, of course, at many different levels, right? So the solidarity we build about impacted communities in, let's say, the Czech Republic, with coal impacted communities in, you know, South Africa or Colombia, is very different to the solidarity we started to build between climate activists into the Czech Republic and climate activists in the same countries, right? Because the targets of what they're trying to do and the strategies that they're following are about building cohesion. And I think, so that's, for me, is about where the solidarity element comes in. It's a twofold: where people are, and then also where we want people to get to in terms of our political demands.
Thank you. Thank you. The second question from the audience I would like to ask, and this one will be focused on Ulrich Brand also, because I know that he has been thinking and writing about this problem, which is connected to the first question from the audience, I would say, and that's, we are demanding that people experience a deep and quite fast change of the way in which they live. And especially because it is now organized as part of the European Green Deal in a manner which is not much socially inclusive and just, we will quite predicted, we can predict that we will also meet some backlash, not only from the elites and the corporations, but we are already meeting backlash from some parts of the broad popular strata of society in the more well-to-do northern societies, which are resisting these changes to their lifestyle. And this is definitely a factor that is also contributing to the rise of far-right politics. How do we tackle that? And how do we, how can we communicate and gain acceptance for these major changes in the way of life that we need, so that we are successful and the backlash is not overwhelming?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to complement very briefly what Asad said on solidarity, because I'm thinking, and I was very active with the Zapatista movement in the 90s. And so what Asad is focusing on, I think this is very important, is an explicit solidarity. But we have, particularly in Western Europe, a history of paternalism, of romanticizing struggles in the global south. So what we need is to know and to engage and to be really to be allied, to be a comrade with the struggles, and not to think so that now the Zapatistas are struggling, have our struggle. It's still our struggle. And I just want to make one point. The conclusion of the imperial mode of living concept is the best solidarity, not the declared, but the de facto solidarity with people of the global south is to change radically our own mode of production and living. Because then the pressure on the resources, the pressure on the cheap labor might relieve. Yeah, I hope you get it. We need empathy. We need knowing what is happening elsewhere, but we should rethink or broaden our understanding of solidarity, not just to think in the struggles, but to think how to change radically here in order to leave room for lives and in other world regions. Walden Bellow, 2004, from the Focus on the Global South, proposed in the outer globalization movement the deglobalization. Deglobalization means to leave room for own developments, for own initiatives in countries of the global south. And then I come also briefly to your question. My argument, I can link it also with the question in the chat, what can we do? What can we do is, of course, in our concrete living situations as professionals, as activists, we should try to make a difference. Yeah? As a teacher, as a university professor, as an NGO activist, whatever. There is no a magic bullet. But what I think, when people will change, or people, please don't take it paternalistically, but the majorities will change their lives not because they are environmentally conscious, but as Asad said, because they can experience a different living. It's not to have less, but to live differently. And this is not the choice, the individual choice of another lifestyle, but it's the condition under which I can live. The other mobility system enables me not to have a car, that I must live the imperial mode of living, that I can live because the framework conditions are a good food, biological food, public transport, public health system, and then so I can avoid to go into a trap of an exploitative and destructive system. I hope you can, because I make this argument because the neoliberal green thinking is the individualization of the responsibility. You have to consume green, you have to behave properly. And what we need is to change the conditions, and it's about collective action. And of course, then it's also about a responsible consumption. But the neoliberal trap is that it's only about responsible and green consumption. And I would say, or what I think probably all of us, it's the concrete conditions of a better living, of a different living. And just to conclude, because Jagoda, you said there are no differences among us. I understood the invitation to a summer school that we complement each other analytically and politically. And I didn't look for differences with you, because I think also this is a trap of the left, that I am a bit different from you, but it's a collective endeavor for us and for the audience to understand better what is going on. This is why I refer to Gramsci, not because I wanted to present myself as a professor and as a smart guy, but I think that hopefully it helps to you to think with the concept of passive revolution, with the concept of imperial mode of living, a bit through the antinomies and contradictions we are living in, but also with the wish to change the world.
Great, great that you also have touched the question of what can we do, because that was the very last question of from the audience that I wanted to address and pose it to Jagoda as a director of one of the largest networks of environmental organizations with I think over 500,000 members in the European Union, but also as a person who combines this this perspective with the understanding with the experience of Croatia, which we could say is part of this post-communist semi-periphery of the European Union, where some of the terms of the debate are different due to different historical experiences. What do you think we can do differently, also compared to the past, or better? It's interesting that you have this new Green Left Party, for example, in parliament in Croatia, because nothing like that is happening in Czech Republic, where the left is in ruins. And it would be interesting to know how that could have happened. So yeah, the last question is on what can people from all walks of life do to put us on track towards the system change that we would like to see.
Yeah, it's kind of general. Well, actually, I agree with Ulrich said, that we should think of collective responses and not to get into the trap of this kind of like individualistic responses will not bring the results, and will just make people feel guilty that they are not doing enough or they cannot do enough because they cannot afford. So from the perspective of environmental activists or climate activists who is not in power, I would say what we could do and what we should do is really bring our voices to much wider audience, that I already said. Like, don't talk just to people that share your opinion. Build a narrative. There are even now systems how actually you can communicate better with wider audience. For instance, before the previous elections, we have done some testings, how you bring message of hope, how frequently you have to talk about hope and solution versus urgency and disaster, because if you're talking only about disaster of climate, people are just feeling very frightened and not being able to act because the problem is so huge. So, you know, like how we talk about it, we have to change that. With whom we talk about it, we have to increase our audience. We have to build a movement. Fridays for Future, what young people have done in Western Europe, there are also some examples in Eastern Europe. Let's build that. Let's bring these voices of young generation, demanding from their perspective as impacted community, the action now. That's all what we can do. In terms of solutions, there are already solutions. We can talk about energy poverty, how to transition and actually eradicate energy poverty. We can talk about energy community. We can talk about renovation wave, how to insulate our buildings, how government can use recovery package, and also national recovery strategies that are going to be presented in next 6 months. So let's open debate about that, build in these plans positive solutions for benefits of everybody, and kick out investment in gas, for example, and fossil fuels. There's lots of things we can do in a very short period of time. It's very good timing, but we have to really recognize that and take this opportunity. And in a case if there is going to be the stronger movement, there's more likely you will have also politicians supporting that. And that's example that we have now in Croatia with the Green Left coalition in parliament. They're very active, and they started to put on in public debate climate for the first time. Green Deal in terms of implementation for the first time. How we should do this recovery. So actually, our message is that going into political debate, and that's the first kind of step. The second step is to actually get into power, because we can do, and there was a question about how we can do this transition when there is no time, actually. Some measures can be implemented quite quickly. Isolation of buildings can be done quite quickly, next 5 to 10 years. Public transportation can be done quite quickly, also in that period. Mass investment into such key sectors in the same time with interdicting fossil fuels can bring massive change in just a decade. And that's exactly what we need. So let's try to do that. And I think I would like to also give a short feedback. There was a question about universal basic income and shorter working time. Yes, that's a big debate, and it's also linked with digitalization and how many how many jobs are they, for whom are they, and also the quality of job versus quality of living and so on. It's a huge debate. I think we should have this debate, and probably some of the answers are lying also in working less. Why we are still working 40 hours a week? We could work 4 days a week. We could have better quality of life, more time for family and friends. And this is not going to be decrease of quality, it will be increase of quality. And also universal basic income can be one of the solutions, but there is lots of debate how this is constructed. So I will not go into that now, because it's a huge debate in itself. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm taking notes. That was a nice conclusion, I think, in terms of practical politics and strategy. I would like to conclude by thanking you mainly that you have come to debate these topics with us. I would also like to thank all the people from Reset and around who helped to prepare this, our technicians, our interpreters, the whole team. And I also need to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Prague for making this possible, and to our audience that it was great having you here also posing questions. I hope you enjoyed the debate and it was informative, and it can inspire you to, as Jagoda said, create the support that we need so that politicians listen or get in power ourselves and change things for the better, which this whole debate was all about. Thank you again for joining us today, and all the best also with your work. And I hope we will see each other at other opportunities in this process.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you to everyone, and nice meeting you.
It was really great. I hope that we stay in touch. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Ulrich, drop me an email, right?
Yes. Bye-bye.
Me too. Bye-bye.
Enjoy. Yeah.
Bye, Jagoda.
Bye. Good night.